Hi, this is Michael Becker. We're going to talk about two relevant writing languages, if you will, to be able to stylize your content in Tinderbox. And they're increasingly common languages in the internet and particularly useful for knowing and understanding their use in Tinderbox. And that's Markdown and HTML. So let's just jump to my file and take a look. So what you're seeing here is a Tinderbox file, and I've constructed a handful of notes. So I've got a README file, a file written in Markdown, a file written in HTML. I've got a CSS example that I'll share with you here. Here is an example. And then you'll see I've got some reference documents and such. So let's just jump right in and discuss what this is. So first and foremost, there's kind of two languages that we want to discuss: Markdown and HTML. I'm going to focus on Markdown primarily for this lesson. Markdown is a standard shorthand for stylizing content that will be rendered from Markdown by an engine to HTML, and it was developed by a gentleman named John Gruber, and Aaron Schwartz back in around 2004. Because again, what they wanted to do is they wanted to quickly take shorthand notes and then be able to have those rendered easily as HTML when they want to go publish those shorthand notes. Over time, a lot of versions of Markdown have evolved. My brief study has shown there's about 30 different derivations of Markdown that's out there, and there is no real standard on how to effectively both use those derivations and or render them. In 2012, a gentleman by the name of John McFarlane, as well as Jeff Atwood, got together and started an effort to standardize Markdown rendering through a method they call, or an organization or group they call CommonMark. And this is just a group of people that have come together to try to standardize the use of Markdown. So that gives you a bit of history, but let me show you what's going on here. So let's just focus on the two languages, Markdown and HTML. I'm going to start with HTML. So if you're going to be, and again, the whole point is how do we take our raw notes and stylize them. So this is an example of a raw note, heading 1. Now, if I want to style that heading 1, I would wrap it in HTML tags. So heading 1 and closing that heading tag. If I want to stylize it with a heading 2, I'd say H2, close it with an H2. In HTML, if I wanted to create a bulleted list, I'd use either an ordered list or an unordered list. So a UL tag or an OL tag, and then the lead tags to be able to call out something as actually as a bullet. And then I would essentially do this to get my bullet 1, 2, and 3. If I want to create a link in HTML, I use the link tag. If I want to create an image in HTML, I use the HTML tag, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, if we take a look at that and I preview that, this is what you get. So, this is an example of the title, because Tinderbox renders the title of a note as a heading 1 tag. Here's an example of the heading 1 text. And then here is that heading 1 text. And then here is that text slightly smaller in heading 2, the bulleted lists, the link, and an image. So that shows you the way to stylize content using HTML capability. Now, how does Markdown do it? So if we take a look at Markdown, Markdown's a little bit different. So if you want to write and again, there's many versions of Markdown. I'm just giving you some of the most commonly used Markdown notation across the vast majority of the ones that I've seen. And so some of the common methods are, for example, if you want to show a heading 1, you say £1 sign and then you do a space. If you want to show a heading 2, you do £2 and a space. If you want to do a bulleted list, you put bullets, or bulleted list can also, I understand in many cases, be dashes. If you want to be able to represent or show a link, you can just essentially do a bracket, put in your anchor tag, and then parentheses and the URL. If you want to show an image, you do an exclamation point, the bracket, anchor, the text, and then the URL, and then etc. Now, if we want to render this in looking at this in the Markdown, we'll go ahead and again, you get a very similar look and feel between the two. Okay, so that's the point. So what we're doing is it's all about taking our notes, stylizing them with whatever notation methodology we want to use, and then ultimately having those rendered in HTML, and then having other tools render those into documents like a PowerPoint file or a Word file, Excel file, or notes or any other output file, PDF, etc. that you want. Now, here's some interesting things to think about when you're looking about these different notation methodologies for stylizing content. One is, a lot of people the people in the Markdown camp really like it because this is super human readable, right? So if I'm going to export a file to Markdown, I can read this a lot easier than I can, say, if I'm reading this, right? Because all of these tags get in the way. So depending on your strategy, stylizing content in Markdown can be really useful if you want people to be able to read the raw unstylized content. And, again, this is a lot harder to kind of read than this. So that's one benefit of Markdown. The other benefit of Markdown is it's a lot faster and it limits in errors. But interestingly enough, Markdown, you do want to get some muscle memory with certain things. So for example, Markdown wants you to have spaces. So if I remove the space between these two tags, you'll notice the heading disappears. If I put the space back, it shows back up. So that's one thing to kind of be aware of. So you need the spacing within Markdown to be useful, to be correct. And you can learn about more of these. Here's a reference that you can go to for common Markdown reference of different ways of doing Markdown. Now, let's pause there. So what we've basically just shown you so far is the ability to show you the distinctions between writing in Markdown versus writing in HTML to help stylize your content and generate that output that you want. Now, again, let me show you. When I do this, these two methods, you'll look here, Markdown is being generated through a Markdown engine to generate HTML. And if I look in the HTML, you'll see that too is HTML. Let's just look at the bulleted list. Bullet list, lead tags, right? If I go to Markdown and I look at the HTML, same thing. So again, the key to understanding this is that these are notation methods to ultimately get to the same path, that stylized HTML, that stylized look and feel. The other thing I want to show you here is when we look at doing this in Tinderbox, is there's some really exciting capabilities that you have within Tinderbox. So for example, you're aware of prototypes. So when you want to create a Markdown file in prototype, well, what does that really mean? You can go to File, Prototypes, and add Markdown. Okay, and you'll see, and that's my Markdown prototype. And essentially what that does is it turns off the smart quotes within the text fields so that it's not going to dynamically turn your, say, straight quotes to curly quotes, for example, in your text fields. What it's also going to do is it's going to turn off this markup text so that Tinderbox knows that this is in fact specifically a Markdown file, and it will render it appropriately. And so that's the really important idea to realize and think about, is the rendering engine that you choose to use to display your text, your Markdown and or your HTML is critically important. So for example, if I'm looking at just a standard note, let's do a test note, and I create a standard note in Tinderbox and I say test. Okay, now, and I'll go ahead and delete that. So if I've got this standard note here, you'll notice here it's a standard HTML file, it's showing markup, and when I go preview it, it's test note, and I go look at the HTML, you'll see I'm getting a heading 1 text and p tag. So it's using the standard Tinderbox rendering engine to manage that. Now, this file is using that too because it's primarily an HTML file. Now, this is where it gets interesting when we look at Markdown. So as I said in the beginning of this lesson, there are, basically 30 or more different versions of Markdown that are out there in the world. And there are a handful of different rendering engines that are being used to render Markdown, or methodologies or strategies, if you will. CommonMark is the one that's starting to bubble up or be recognized as, or it's an attempt to create a universal global standard around rendering Markdown. And that's what Tinderbox is standardized on. So for example, if I go here and create a test note Markdown note, and I apply the Markdown prototype, when I go look at that note, one, you'll see that the markup text has been removed. But also, if I go look at its HTML preview command, the developers at Tinderbox have Markdown being rendered through a CommonMark template, so that it's following that CommonMark standard. Now, let me show you what that, in practice, what that means. So if I look at this file, and I'm now going to show you, we're looking at this note here in leveraging the CommonMark preview engine. Now, there's another tool out there that you may have heard of recently. We've been talking about it quite extensively in the forum, and that's Pandoc. And Pandoc is this universal tool to be able to take text, transform it, and into other text. So you can take Markdown files and turn them into HTML files, Word files, PDF files. You can take HTML files and transfer those into Word files or PDF files, etc. These are different rendering engines. So I've created a stamp here that basically is going to allow me to direct the Tinderbox to not render my note, my Markdown in using CommonMark, but rather render my Markdown using Pandoc. So what I'm going to do is tell Tinderbox to change the preview command, and essentially, instead of processing it with CommonMark, I'm telling Tinderbox, process it with these notes with Pandoc, and I want you to take the Markdown, and I want you then to push that to HTML, and I'll show you what this other stuff is in a minute. So what I'm doing here too is just make sure that the text markup is false, and then I also want you to use my my HTML template because this is for preview. So when I hit apply, look what happens. So and here again, really interesting thing to consider when you're looking at the rendering engine, because I'm using Pandoc. The Pandoc Markdown will actually recognizes this part of the Markdown strategy. So if you do a bracket width equals 50 pixel, and let's just change it to 75 just for fun. All right. What that, Pandoc Markdown recognizes that after an image Markdown notation, if there's a curly bracket here with the designation of width and or height for that image, Pandoc will process it. So you'll see here that my image got a little bigger now that I changed it to 75. But if you see, if I go back and I revert the attributes of this note to be using CommonMark for preview, look what happens. It takes the standard size of the image and it just puts this as text because it doesn't know what to do with that with command. So that's one example where you have Markdown, two Markdown engines working in very different ways. The other thing to take a look at, let's go back to our example here. You'll see here in HTML, down here, Markdown bulleted list in HTML. So I've bulleted this list. Well, HTML is a more mature method and standard, and HTML standards know to kind of take these asterised bulleted lists and turn them into a bulleted list. So if I look at preview, I get that bulleted list. Now, if I do that same thing in Markdown, but this time I'm going to show you where I'm taking HTML and I'm going to try to process HTML through a Markdown engine. And when I do that, nothing happens because again, essentially the Markdown engines don't know what to do with the, well, Pandoc knows what to do with the HTML, but CommonMark does not. So there's another example of doing that. Now, one might ask at this point then too is, well, why doesn't Tinderbox standardize on Pandoc? Well, because a lot of extra stuff needs to be installed on your computer, such as Pandoc itself. And then if you are going to do any other specialized methods, you'll have to add extra, even more software to be able to support some of these more advanced rendering capabilities. So again, I just want to kind of show you the power of Tinderbox and its attribute methods for you to be able to actually manipulate and change different engines that you're doing there. Now, here's something else that's kind of interesting and fun as well. When you're in Tinderbox, you can also leverage style sheets. So for example, you'll see here, if I go, you'll see that I've created a style sheet and I'm showing you a real basic style sheet. Essentially, I want my heading 1s to be black. I want my headings 2s to be blue. I want my heading 3s to be black, and I want them to be underlined. I want my text to be blue. So, and now if I go into my template and I actually enter in and I tell my template, HTML, CSS style, that I want the style to be used for these templates to be this file here, I now can go to these notes and render these notes leveraging the HTML style. So for example, if I now change the template that this note is using from HTML to HTML CSS style, you'll see it all renders. And in this case, let's take a look. It's making the heading 2 blue. And if we go back to the style, you'll see if I want to change this from red, you'll see that it is now going to make the text red. So that's what a style sheet does for you. And again, that will equally work as equally effective with the Pandoc rendering engine of Markdown as it would for the sorry. And I've got to make sure that I go back and put the styling sheet there. And you'll see the Pandoc rendering engine does that just as effectively as the CommonMark engine. So we can leverage the CSS styling in that methodology just as well. So that's basically the core of what I wanted to show you, this distinction of these different notation methodologies you can use to be taking your notes to help you stylize your content. And which you choose to use is really up to what your ultimate goal is and how you see yourselves using these notes down the road. Now, one other thing I want to show you too is let's look at exporting. What we've been showing you right now is how you export, how you preview this Markdown content in Tinderbox. Now, what about actually exporting it out of Tinderbox? So let's say I click this note and I go to File and I hit Export and I say Export, export selected note, and it's going to process that. And it's going to ask me where I want to put it. So let's go ahead and put it here, and I'll create an export temp. Okay, so there's my export temp, and we're going to go ahead and export that note into Tinderbox. Now let me go find that file. And I'll go to Pandoc, my export files. Okay, and you'll see here's the file that we've done. And you'll see, but interestingly enough, it exported it out as a Markdown text file. And let me go ahead and open that up, and you'll see, but again, you'll see that it's all in HTML, because remember, just because you put the notation into Markdown doesn't mean it will be converted to Markdown or stay as Markdown, or in this case, it was converted to HTML, because that's what we told the rendering engine to do. So let me show you some other examples on how you would administer and manage that. If I go here, you'll see that I've created a stamp that will allow me to actually export my Markdown as actual Markdown. So in this case, I'm saying markup text equals false. The extension is .md, and I want to tell the template that I use to not use HTML, because if you see here, and let me do that here. By the way, I'll show you this. I'm going to change this to HTML. All right, let me go here. I'll go File, Export Individual Note. Okay, and you'll see the file extension is HTML. So if I export that file as HTML, I'll come here, and you can see we'll now open up that file in HTML, and I'll drag it over. Okay, and you'll see we've now got that file that we've just produced, and it's now in HTML. And in both these situations, both as an extension of Markdown, as an extension of HTML, the text actually came through as HTML, because that was the template we were using when we rendered that file. So now if I go back to my file here, and I can either apply the stamp that I've created, which is essentially putting the Markdown file to .md and switching the template. Now let me show you the template. rather than having Tinderbox render the file as a template, this time I'm going to have Tinderbox render the file as HTML. And so what I'm essentially telling Tinderbox to do is just process this file, make the name of the file a Markdown heading 1 item, and then just grab the text of the file and stick it into the output without being processed. That's what this template is essentially doing. I'm not wrapping the information with HTML. So now if I go here, and I apply this stamp to the file, and if you go look here now, that's essentially switched it to an MD file and made it Markdown. I then can go and hit export. Okay, and you'll see I've got my elements in Markdown. I'm going to call it R2 because I don't want to delete the other one that we had already created. Hit export. Oops, I put it in the wrong directory. Let me do that again. I go selected note. I say export temp R2. Hit export. You see the files there, and now I've got an R2 file, and when I look at that file, you'll see that it's actually now been rendered and exported out as Markdown, as well as the raw HTML that we had there before. Whereas if I looked at the first one we did when we processed it through the HTML template, not the Markdown template, you'll see that it had all of the stylized HTML. So again, this really shows you the power of Tinderbox and your ability to fundamentally transform how you're managing and using your data, both in the form of how you're previewing your data. Again, so in this context, look here in this preview, I am using the Markdown template. If I change this template to say HTML, and I change the template back to say the stylized HTML, then the preview is going to be different. Because again, the Tinderbox preview is based on what export template that you've applied it to use. So again, hopefully this is making sense in that it shows you the absolute power and flexibility you have with Tinderbox to be able to, both, write your content in Tinderbox, curate this content, determining how you want it to be previewed in Tinderbox, and then ultimately determining what type of export format you want to be using. And in later presentations and trainings, we'll show you how to transform that export into other document formats, leveraging tools like Pandoc. The last thing I wanted to show you in this demonstration, though, again, in the power of looking at the rendering of Tinderbox, and especially for you academics out there or business professionals that need to cite your work. When you're citing your work in Markdown, it's kind of common to be doing it, and or if you're needing to be doing footnotes. You can be using a little bracket and an anchor tag or cite key, if you will. And then you'll see here the common method for Markdown for footnotes is you do a bracket, a caret, or a little hat, and then the number of the footnote. And then down on the bottom of your page, you say that same notation and then do a colon, a space, and that's how you get your footnote. So if I wanted to create another footnote, let's say I go like here, and I say, here is some text. And now I want to footnote that text. So I'm going to go bracket, hat, 2, bracket, and then I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to just copy this to make it a little faster for myself. And I say 2, and say, here is the number 2 footnote. Okay, so now when I render this, and I want to make sure that for the purposes of this, we want this to be rendering in CommonMark, so I can show you the difference. I'm going to hit preview. Okay, and so you'll see here I've got, interestingly enough, I've got my footnotes here, but CommonMark is not rendering those footnotes as I expected nor wanted. And so now let me show you what happens when I render this page using the Pandoc Markdown rendering engine. And you'll see, as noted earlier, I mentioned to you I had some extra flags that I had put into the Pandoc rendering engine command. I was telling Pandoc to use a cite processor, a citation processor, as well as specifying the bibliography file where all of my citations with their citation keys are located. And I'll show you, and I can give you an example of what that type of file looks like. Is we can go over here. Let me move this away, and I'll show you what a citation key file looks like really quick. Okay, and this is an example of a citation key file. And we'll go ahead and open this up in BibTeX so you can see it. So a citation key file is essentially a BibTeX file that you can export out of your citation manager. And this is an example of a citation key. And so what Pandoc is going to do is it's going to get pointed to this file. And then when you do that and you actually preview it, and I'm going to show you now, I'm going to apply the stamp so that we can now preview this file in Pandoc. Look what happens. It actually converts the Markdown to the, in this case, an APA styled insertion citation. It did it there as well. It also converted the footnotes to actual real footnotes. And then it inserted the actual bibliography item for that note in the preview. So again, incredibly effective use and tool. And then when you actually run this exported file through the Pandoc engine, it will put the bibliography at the back of the document. It will stick footnotes into the footnote of the document, and you'll have a perfectly formatted document based on whatever styling strategy that you happen to need based on the template you had. So that's it. Hopefully you found this this lesson interesting and impactful. I mean, there's a lot here. Essentially, I've exposed you to this whole new concept of Markdown, of leveraging HTML, of using different rendering engines within Tinderbox, exporting notes, and then ultimately showing you, at least teasing you with this idea of linking your citation methods into different tools like Pandoc and the use of a BibTeX citation files so that you can actually make your academic and professional work a lot more easy. Now, if you want to learn more about this, shoot me some comments on this video. Let me know what you think. Let me know what your questions are. Happy to do second level, third level detailed trainings on any elements that you might want to learn a little bit more about. As always, if you don't mind, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to tell your friends. Thank you very much. Bye.